Hi everyone and welcome to the Scrapbook.com YouTube channel. I am Natasha and I am excited to be with you today sharing a mixed media card filled with Scrapbook.com exclusives. First, I am grabbing the Roma stencil and I'm going to grab my mint tape and put this in place on my mat. I do have an A2 size card panel here in place as well. Once I am satisfied with how everything lines up, I grab my distress oxides and I am using squeezed lemonade, tumbled glass, and picked raspberry. So I begin with the squeezed lemonade. I start from the center and work my way out, kind of lightening up the amount of ink towards the edges. I then go in with the tumbled glass and cover more of the card panel. Again, focusing on the center and then working my way out to the corners. And lastly, I use the pick raspberry and I just kind of put that down towards the center and blend all over. I am using these three colors to create my own little rainbow. So I do go back in and ink blend over where the colors meet to ensure that they are blended well and create my colors. So now you see my rainbow of colors. But I'm not done with the stencil, so I just wipe off the excess ink and then clean up my stencil. Now we are back and I am realigning my stencil, shifting to the right a bit and trying to ensure that there is a bit of overlap so it looks like the pattern is continuous. You'll see me shift the stencil and then move it up to place it where I would like for it to be. Now I'm using my cloud whip here and I'm just going to go over the stencil using this Hero Arts palette knife. I like using this palette knife because I can just scrape off the excess right back into the jar since the jar is the 2-ounce jar of the cloud whip. It's a bit of a smaller opening. It does not take the cloud whip very long to dry because this is a thin layer. If you would like it to sparkle or your cloud whips be a different color, feel free to add in additional mediums like pops of color or paint to get your cloud whip the color that you desire. Once I am satisfied with how this looks, again, I just scrape off all of my excess, remove that stencil, and this is what we are left with. Before moving this to the side to dry, I go in with my palette knife and just scrape off the overhang of cloud whip. I don't want to have to break that off once the cloud whip has set because it may make my paper rip. So just try to get that off beforehand. Moving on, I have grabbed my shape dies. This is the Joyful Shape Die set. We will be using that thank you, sentiment, and backer from that. I also have the Sprigs die set. I am going to be using only 2 of those sprigs and I will be die cutting that out of some black cardstock. I die cut those out 4 times to have a total of 8 black sprigs to use on my card front. I also have my holographic paper pad and I'm using a silver page from that paper pad as well as some white cardstock. I grab my adhesive sheets. These are originally 6 by 8.5 in size, but of course I'm using some that is left over to fit these smaller pieces of paper. I'm only going to add that to my silver cardstock and my white cardstock. To my silver cardstock, I'm adding the thank you dies. And from my white cardstock, I'll be die cutting that backer piece for the thank you sentiment. So you will see me using my tweezers to remove those small pieces, and then I will just pick up the die cut off of the sheet to easily remove it from that backer piece. Once I have all of the backer removed, I'm just going to press the silver thank you down onto the white backer. My card panel is completely dry and I will now be adding a bit of bling. My bling of choice is the Pink Fresh Clear Drops in Ice. They are just clear silver backed drops, which I think will add a nice pop and more texture to this card. I am adhering those using the artist glue from Scrapbook.com. I, of course, could not find my jewel picker when I needed it, so I'm just using my Scrapbook.com tweezers to pick these drops up. They are domed, so that definitely helps. If they were flat, I would be struggling more, or I probably would not have used them. But because they are domed, I'm able to easily pick them up and place them with my tweezers. I am using two different sizes of those clear drops in ice. If you think about this Roma Mosaic towel in terms of there being bursts of color, and the larger burst of color is where the larger gem is going, and the smaller cross section where these colors meet, that is where my smallest gems are going. I continue adding my drops in this pattern all the way down until my panel is filled. However, I do leave a space for my sentiment. With all of my clear drops in place, I then move on to adding my sprigs onto my card and placing my sentiment. I began by cutting a few of those sprigs down. Some were too tall to fit on my card without a bunch of overhang, and I figured I could use those to fill in gaps later. So I just trimmed the bottom smaller leaves of those sprigs off, and I am placing all of my sprigs around where this sentiment should be centered. I start with the larger pieces first because, again, I'll use the smaller ones to fill in any gaps. I do place a tad bit of glue underneath where the sentiment will sit, just to keep those sprigs in place. Remember that when you are placing these sprigs, it is all about personal preference. When I was placing them, I just chose not to have too many of the same types of sprigs side by side. I also did not want there to be too much overlapping because it can make things bulky, and I already have the clear drops that I have on the page, so I did not want to create any additional bulk that would keep my sentiment from laying flat on the page. As you can see, I am going in and securing those ends of the sprigs with my artist glue and clipping away anything that overhangs that I may be able to use as filler. Once I am confident in their placement, I do decide to go ahead and pop up the thank you sentiment using some Scrapbook.com foam squares, and I put those in place. I have already used all of my larger foam squares, so for this sentiment, I had the tedious task of removing the backing off of all of these tiny squares, but they got the job done with no issue. So with my sentiment placed, I'm moving on to filling in those small gaps in the sprigs that I see. I'm just adding in those remainder of the leaves that I cut off of some of the larger sprigs. And I'm going to make sure that they do not overlap my gems or clear drops that I put down because I took the time to put them on there. I want as many to show as possible. I love how these black sprigs contrast against the tiled background that we created. It's such a nice pop. I love it. So to finish up, I am clipping off and securing any of the overhang that I see. I do cut off those tails, but I go back in and add a bit of glue just to make sure that they don't move when this card is either placed in an envelope or just handled in general. To finish this off, I just add more artist glue and adhere my card panel to a top folding card base. I hope this tutorial has inspired you to get a little messy and have fun creating. Thank you so much for joining me today on Scrapbook.com's YouTube channel. I am Natasha of Polite Creations. Feel free to head over and subscribe to my YouTube or follow me on Instagram at Polite Creations. Have a great day.